This is a response to developments in the UK, which is the first country to greenlight a vaccine. It's given fast-tracked approval to Pfizer, not only to manufacture a vaccine in response to COVID, but has also given the company legal immunity from prosecution. So according to the UK government, if you are harmed by a vaccine, you do not have the right to sue Pfizer or any other pharmaceutical company, or indeed anyone else in the supply chain. Clearly, this is a violation of the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm. It's also a violation of Magna Carta, and specifically paragraph 40, which I'm going to quote. To no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. So by denying right, denying justice to anyone harmed by a vaccine, the British government is in violation of Magna Carta. So I'm going to talk about the UK government giving Pfizer this sweetheart deal, this get out of jail free card, and attempting to overthrow 8 centuries of legal precedent. And I'm going to set this in the context, I've been saying this from the outset really about COVID, that it is our champion pathogen. When it first made its presence felt, in the West at least, in the beginning of 2020, we saw awakenings of a new world. We saw skies and waterways clear. The oil prices went negative at one point because the producers were having to pay people to take it off their hands. And that's an indication of the kind of world I would love to live in. The homeless were housed, prisoners were set free. They were talking about universal basic income. The UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire to end the sickness of war. And even the World Bank called on G20 leaders to offer debt relief to the world's poorest countries. So immediately, COVID made its mark as a reformer. And it indicated that it is here to set us free from the structures of exploitation and enslavement that have been oppressing the planet and its peoples and its species. There's precedent for this, most famously in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, where Moses uses plague as an abolitionist in his campaign to set the Israelites free from their enslavement in Egypt. And there were 10 plagues in all. Finally, the stiff-necked leader, Pharaoh, ended up dead. He was drowned by his own hubris in the Red Sea. And the basic demands are simple. They're the kinds of things that Christ was saying in the New Testament. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, heal the sick, house the homeless, set prisoners free. And vaccines are an attempt to dodge the obvious message we're getting from this virus. They are an attempt to reassert business as usual. And Moses and his brother Aaron began this abolitionist campaign when they came to Pharaoh's court, with Aaron throwing down his staff to demonstrate the power of God, and the staff turned into a snake. And similarly, though COVID may appear viperous and venomous, its ultimate agenda is a benevolent one of abolition. And if you're familiar with the story in Exodus, you may know that what happens is that the conjurers at Pharaoh's court produce their own trick by throwing down a staff that turns into a snake. They threw down their staffs that turned into snakes, but Aaron's snake consumed their snake. So if you imagine this is COVID as a viper, and these are the serpents of Pharaoh as vaccines. The result is that COVID defeats them easily. And that could be because, I don't know, because COVID maybe mutates, or because the vaccines just simply collapse under their own weight. The Pfizer vaccine requires storage and transmission at minus 70 degrees centigrade. Also consider the structure of COVID, which you've seen under the magnified images, that of a central sphere, a bright central sphere that's surrounded by dark goads. And COVID is goading us. But behind the goading is this bright halo structure that sings of a higher divine purpose. So that's the context that I'm setting this in. Now, this sweetheart deal that was given to Pfizer, shocking as it is, was signalled a few months ago because the UK government produced a so-called consultation document where they set out to confer legal immunity on pharmaceutical companies. And the title of this so-called consultation document is Changes to Human Medicine Regulation to Support the Rollout of COVID-19 Vaccines. I only saw the document a few days before the deadline to respond, and it's a very long document, so it took quite a scramble for me to produce that response. But because of the ridiculous haste, most people didn't know of its existence. Most people still don't know of its existence, and didn't, let alone have time to respond. As might be expected of a paper written by government bureaucrats, it is repetitive, it is boring, it is dull, but it is also Orwellian. It is a blueprint for an Orwellian blueprint. If you haven't read 1984 by George Orwell, then I strongly recommend that you do. It's a prophetic novel. And prophecy is not just seeing into the future. Prophecy can be seeing into the present, seeing what's going on. And often prophecy is merely seeing the obvious and stating the obvious. But of course, governments and corporations, sometimes religions, condition people to overlook the obvious, to not see it, or if they see it, to not acknowledge it. So the kind of prophecy that Orwell gives us is the inoculation. That's the inoculation against the totalitarian tendencies that governments will take if they're not checked, and that the UK government is now pursuing at breakneck speed. But not only is that document badly written, not only is it Orwellian, it's also ignorant and stupid and foolish. I've written an extensive critique of it, and if you want to look into it in more detail, it's in my book series versus Empire, specifically book 3. So the link for that is geni.us/POTUS. But just right now for this video, I'll say a couple of things that are in the beginning of that document, the absurd assumptions on which everything else, all the falsehood, is based, and these statements which reveal these absurd assumptions that reveal why the whole vaccine program is a house built on sand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote this first statement from the document, and then I'm going to just be silent for 10 seconds so you can take those 10 seconds to consider the veracity or otherwise of this statement. Quote, COVID-19 is the biggest threat this country has faced in peacetime history. Unquote. So consider this. Is COVID a bigger threat than the Black Death, which wiped out between a third and a half of the population when it swept through Europe in the 14th century? Is COVID more of a threat than the Spanish flu, which showed up 100 years ago? Is COVID more of a threat than the plague that gripped London prior to the Great Fire of London in 1666? Is COVID more of a threat than climate change? Is COVID more of a threat than nuclear weapons? Is COVID more of a threat than nuclear power? Is COVID more of a threat than hunger or poverty or any of the other diseases that are ravaging people around the planet? And now the second assumption on which this document is based. Quote, effective COVID-19 vaccines will be the best way to deal with the pandemic, unquote. So I saw this document in September, months before this so-called vaccine even existed. And it's making a claim for a hypothetical vaccine that doesn't exist yet, for a vaccine that has absolutely no track record. Meanwhile, effective measures have been implemented in other countries in the world without any need for vaccines and have brought cases down to zero in countries like New Zealand and Taiwan and Vietnam, and it's called contact tracing. But why do something so easy and simple and effective as contact tracing when you can do something so much more expensive and unwieldy and controlling as vaccines? The other company, another company that was in the lead to distribute a vaccine was AstraZeneca. You may remember the hype about that several months ago. And they paused their trial at one point, and I'm quoting their own statement now. They paused the trial because of, quote, severe neurological symptoms consistent with transverse myelitis or inflammation of the spinal cord. And that trial resumed again after a few days. Also, the consultation document admitted the possibility of vaccines causing anaphylactic shock. Had to pause to say that, anaphylactic shock. So this is not conspiracy theory. These are documented effects from vaccines, from a pharmaceutical company, and from the government itself. So, welcome to the UK, and welcome to the reign of stupid. I'm going to mention a couple of other elements of the consultation document. I made my submission in time for their deadline for comment. It was logical, it was reasonable, it was coherent, it was well argued, well informed. But the government didn't even make a response. They just went ahead and did what they always intended to do anyway, and put this consultation document out as a kind of smokescreen. So on that basis, they are going to attempt to implement the other measures of this document, so I'll just summarize them now. First, an expanded workforce to administer the vaccines, including members of the armed forces. So they are envisaging a scenario where not just healthcare professionals, not just doctors or nurses, not just registered healthcare professionals, but government contractors and members of the military will be administering vaccines. So think about that. People who are trained to kill, people who are trained to coerce are giving injections. The other main element mentioned in the document is vaccine promotion or advertising, or as I prefer to call it, propaganda. So expect to see, and in fact, they've already started showing up, expect to see over the coming weeks and months uh, soft focus images in government advertising, or what purports, or government advertising that purports to be something else. Soft focus images, soothing music, smiling families, testimony from people who say they've had the vaccine, and oh, isn't it wonderful? It has already begun. I was listening to a BBC podcast about a Portuguese poet just yesterday, and the BBC intruded, and by tacking on to the end of this podcast a promotion for another podcast series called How to Vaccinate the World. And it's produced by one Tim Harford, and he said, quote, "This is how the pandemic ends, not with a bang, but with a shot, or rather, billions of shots. In a new podcast series from the BBC, we'll be covering the defining story of the crisis, the search for a vaccine." Really? Vaccines are the defining story of the crisis? Not that COVID is exposing the structures of exploitation and enslavement and injustice in our world? Not that COVID is housing the homeless or setting prisoners free? They think vaccines are the defining story? And the next thing he says is, "And of course, there are other questions. How will we persuade people to take the vaccine?" By planting propaganda messages in BBC podcasts, perhaps? And then he says, "And who gets to go to the front of the queue of several billion people?" I would suggest the fearful and the gullible. So the idea is, the message is, getting vaccinated is a privilege and you should feel lucky and grateful to be at the front of the queue. And think again about that title, How to Vaccinate the World, not how to feed the world, clothe the world, house the world, clean the world, heal the world, or set the world free. No, how to vaccinate the world. So now we know the BBC is enlisted in the government's propaganda campaign, and I hate to say this because I love the BBC, they do some really good work, but they have become a corporate shill. And it's not just intrusion into the podcast space. I have on my phone an app called Nextdoor. It's supposed to be a community app where people can exchange information and tips and share what's going on in the neighborhood. And someone posted a question which led us to a very interesting thread about this area being in Tier 3 with the UK government's COVID restrictions, which is the highest tier. And the general tenor of the comments afterwards was that this was indiscriminate, heavy-handed, and overreaction. Lo and behold, the next day, the entire thread disappeared without a murmur. Also, whenever I post something in Instagram where the image has the word COVID on it, there's an unwanted and uninvited message from the National Health Service imposing itself into my post. So from these intrusions into social media, now they want to intrude into your body, right? And we have a word for that. When someone sticks something into you that you don't want stuck into you, what do we call it? We call it rape. Now, I don't want you to make the simplistic conclusion, oh, Abdiel thinks vaccines are rape. This is in the context, this is in the analysis of everything I have said in this video so far. But if that's too shocking for you, let me suggest another word. What do you call it when someone tries to get your agreement to let them stick it to you with your consent? Maybe they've lied to you, maybe they've conditioned to you, taken advantage of your naivety or innocence, brainwashed you, cajoled you, threatened you, incentivized you to agree or disincentivized you to disagree so that you become a willing participant, and that's called grooming. And there's one more thing about this preferential treatment that Pfizer is getting. Why, when AstraZeneca was developing a vaccine, I guess it still is, and offers to make that available at cost and at room temperature, does Pfizer get the preferential treatment for a profit-seeking vaccine that is transported at -70 Celsius? AstraZeneca were dishonest. They did not reveal publicly that this vaccine had caused inflammation of the spine during the trials. It was something they told their shareholders, and then the news got out. But even that was too honest in this arena where Pfizer has been promoted. The pharmaceutical companies are like people trying to get into a nightclub to get in and enjoy the cocktails and all the noise and everything. What do you do when you want to get to the front of the queue and get into a nightclub? You bribe the bouncer, you put cash into the bouncer's hand. So my question is, who has been taking bribes in the UK government to get Pfizer leapfrogging AstraZeneca and Pfizer fast-tracked over every other country in the world? In any case, the result is the same. As in the case of Aaron Snake, COVID, and Pharaoh Snakes, the vaccines, this is how it ends in the defeat of the vaccines. I was watching videos of snake battles on YouTube today, and it's a gruesome watch. It's hard to watch, and there's one in particular of a Texas indigo snake, which actually is a non-venomous snake, and in the parlance of YouTube, it owns the rattlesnake it is up against, and kills the rattlesnake, which is of course a venomous species. So that is an indication of how COVID owns the vaccines. Finally, you hear all this talk nowadays of we're living in such a divided and polarized society. We're not. That's an illusion. Yes, the polarization is magnified by social media and by the machinations of Facebook and other social media companies, but ultimately, this is set in a realm that transcends the political spectrum. I don't care what side of the aisle you think you're in, whether you consider yourself Labour or Tory or Lib Dem or Independent or Republican or Democrat or whatever it is. None of us likes totalitarian government. It is inbuilt into our human nature that we uphold the sovereignty of our own bodies. It is inbuilt into our nature that we hate injustice and love human rights. It is inbuilt that we uphold the golden rule, which is to treat others as you would wish to be treated, to love others as you love yourself. And this is the universal longing of mankind, and it's in this universal arena that the UK government and its vaccine dreams are such a violation. So the conclusion is, thank you for sticking with me, I know it's been a long video, that COVID is practicing coercion of its own. It is not calling on us to develop vaccines, but it is here as an abolitionist, and it is calling on governments and leaders. It is coercing governments and leaders, as Moses eventually coerced Pharaoh, to house the homeless, feed the hungry, heal the sick, and stop funding fossil fuel production and pollution. So that's the overall message. And if you happen to be in government and are witness to the bribery, do let the media know, such as The Guardian or The Independent. And let me leave you with this. Though the vaccines will fail, at least they'll give us the opportunity for false hope, to stretch out business as usual and delay reform for a little bit longer, to waste a lot of time, effort, money, and resources in the process, but ultimately fail. Thank you.